Europe is often portrayed as the cradle of enlightenment, home to classical philosophy, Renaissance beauty, revolutionary ideals, and intellectual progress. But beneath the surface of its grand cathedrals, gilded thrones, and marble statues, lies something far more unsettling. A long winding path paved in blood, betrayal, and contradiction. This is not a history of dates and declarations. This is a history of paradoxes, of moments that defy logic, of ideas that turned in on themselves, of victories that felt like loss. A history where tyranny was cloaked in peace, justice served cruelty, and freedom built prisons. For the next 2 hours, you'll drift through 25 paradoxes pulled from the darkest corners of European memory. You'll hear of loyal betrayals, sacred executions, and golden ages built on silent suffering. These are not simply tragedies. They are mirrors, reflecting what happens when ideals are twisted, when order becomes chaos, and when power rewrites its own origin. Some of these stories will lull you, others will disturb you, but all of them will linger, because Europe's history isn't just a timeline, it's a labyrinth. And once you enter, you may begin to see that the most haunting parts are not the wars or the crimes, but the ideas that justified them. Now breathe slowly, let the silence settle, and follow the paradoxes into the dark. Tyranny rarely arrives with a roar. It enters softly, through laws written in the name of order, through leaders who promise protection, through systems that seem to benefit everyone, until one day they don't. This is the paradox of peaceful tyranny, when oppression doesn't look like chains or bloodshed, but like structure, safety, and progress. It is the dictatorship of calm, the violence of stillness. Consider the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who crowned himself Emperor of France in the name of revolution. He rose by promising freedom and unity, but governed with censorship, surveillance, and the quiet crushing of dissent. His empire brought stability and also war across a continent. Millions died in the name of peace. Yet for years, many adored him. To some, tyranny never looked so organized. Or take Franco's Spain, a dictatorship built on silence. After the Spanish Civil War, Franco ruled for nearly 40 years, erasing opposition without fanfare. The trains ran, the economy grew, churches filled again. But dissent vanished. So did thousands of voices. It was tyranny wrapped in religious piety and national pride, efficient, methodical, peaceful. Europe has many such examples. The Habsburg Empire, vast and glittering, boasted centuries of peace in its core territories, but beneath the gold, it suppressed cultures, languages, and entire identities. Its peace came at the cost of ethnic silencing, harmony at the price of erasure. Even the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe operated this way. After World War II, tanks stopped rolling. Cities were rebuilt. Education expanded. But beneath the silence was fear, the knock on the door, the eyes that watched you. Tyranny didn't scream. It hovered, always present, always waiting. What makes peaceful tyranny so dangerous is that it feels like rest. There are no overt signs to resist. You go to work, you come home, you obey, and if you behave, you are left alone. But freedom in this system is a simulation, an illusion granted only to those who conform perfectly. This form of tyranny is seductive. It doesn't break the door down. It offers comfort in exchange for compliance. It whispers, "Why question anything when everything seems fine?" And that's the trap. In a loud tyranny, resistance is visible. In a peaceful one, resistance feels inappropriate, unnecessary, even ungrateful. How do you protest a system that doesn't look like it's hurting you? That's why peaceful tyranny survives so long. It rewrites the definition of violence. It turns laws into armor and bureaucracy into chains. It tells you this is the best the world can be, and slowly, you forget what freedom even looked like. The lesson is as relevant now as it was then. Not all tyrants shout. Some speak in policies, some rule through routine, and some are beloved precisely because they make life feel predictable, even as they drain it of choice. So ask yourself, if peace is built on silence, is it still peace? If order requires obedience without consent, is it still stability? Because in the shadows of Europe's past, the most dangerous regimes were not always the loudest. They were the quiet ones, the ones that smiled. Rebellion conjures images of fire, flags burning, voices shouting, barricades rising in the streets. We imagine rage exploding outward, demanding to be seen. But some rebellions don't look like that at all. Some don't shout. Some barely move. And yet, they're more powerful than gunfire. This is the paradox of silent rebellion. Resistance that does not scream, but whispers, waits, and endures. It is the rebellion that survives by staying invisible. Look no further than Occupied Poland during World War II. Nazi forces banned Polish education beyond a basic level, hoping to erase cultural memory. But the response wasn't open revolt. It was a secret network of underground schools. Teachers held classes in homes, basements, even forests. Children risked death to attend. There were no speeches, no explosions, just quiet learning. Quiet, defiance, silent rebellion, or consider the Soviet gulags. Among the starvation, forced labor, and despair, some prisoners resisted not with escape or violence, but by refusing to forget who they were. They recited forbidden poetry. They carved tiny icons from scraps of wood. They remembered their real names. Their rebellion wasn't to fight, it was to remain. One of the most haunting examples comes from Nazi concentration camps, where music was banned or tightly controlled. Yet prisoners composed symphonies in secret. They played on makeshift instruments. Songs remembered from youth became prayers, shields, tiny acts of refusal. Singing became survival. The notes said, "You have my body, but not my soul." Even in Francoist Spain, where speaking certain languages like Catalan or Basque was forbidden, entire communities kept their identities alive by speaking them in private, passing them to children, writing them into coded songs. There were no riots, no marches, just families at dinner tables, refusing to vanish. What makes silent rebellion so powerful is that it doesn't need recognition. It isn't always trying to win. Sometimes, it just refuses to lose. This makes it hard to destroy. You can crush a protest, you can kill a leader, but how do you kill a decision not to give in? How do you stop someone from remembering, from whispering, from being? Silent rebellion exposes a terrifying truth for tyrants. Control is never complete. Power is never absolute. Somewhere, someone is always quietly refusing. And that refusal plants seeds. Seeds that grow into future revolutions. But this paradox is also painful, because silence can be mistaken for compliance. Whole generations of resistors vanished from record because they didn't leave behind banners or speeches, just memories, just survival. And in our thirst for drama and action, we forget them, and yet they may be the bravest of all. Because silent rebellion requires patience. It requires living in the mouth of the wolf while pretending not to flinch. It means waiting, not knowing if the world will ever remember you, and resisting anyway. So when you read history, listen not just to the noise, but to the absences, the gaps, the gestures that don't make headlines, because somewhere in that quiet, someone was saying no, not with fists, not with flames, but with presence, with memory, with silence. Because in Europe's darkest hours, the rebellion that was hardest to kill was the one that never made a sound. Fire has always been a symbol of purification. It destroys, but it also renews. In myth and ritual, it burns away corruption, clears the path for rebirth. But in the hands of history, fire is rarely clean. It is used not to heal, but to justify harm. In Europe's darkest moments, fire was seen as holy, necessary, even merciful. This is the paradox of cleansing fire, destruction used in the name of salvation. Flames that were meant to purify, but only left ash. Nowhere is this more visible than in the Inquisition. For centuries, Catholic authorities pursued heretics, witches, and so-called sinners. Those deemed guilty were often burned at the stake. Not for punishment, but for purification. It was said that fire cleansed the soul, that in agony, the damned could be redeemed. Execution became salvation. Death became healing. This twisted logic allowed for horrors cloaked in righteousness. In medieval France, the Cathars, a Christian sect with different theological views, were exterminated in the name of spiritual unity. Whole towns were burned. One priest famously said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." It wasn't genocide, it was cleansing. Even outside of religion, fire was used to reshape society. During the Nazi regime, thousands of books were burned in public squares. Literature by Jews, communists, intellectuals, all thrown into flames. The goal wasn't to erase ideas, they claimed, but to purify German culture. Flames lit not by hate, but by a twisted vision of moral hygiene. In Eastern Europe, entire villages were burned during forced relocations, not just as military strategy, but to cleanse borders, erase identities, make space for new orders. Fire turned homes into warnings, culture into smoke. But perhaps the most intimate use of fire was in the witch trials. Across Europe, from Germany to Scotland to Switzerland, women were accused, tortured, and burned alive. Their crime? Healing, without license, speaking too freely, owning too much land, and always the justification was the same. She must be cleansed. Fire would return her to purity. What makes this paradox so disturbing is that it frames violence as virtue. People didn't just tolerate these acts. They believed in them. They saw fire as divine, as transformative, and in that belief, they made space for atrocities that no rational system would allow. Because once destruction is rebranded as purification, anything becomes permissible. You don't just destroy the enemy, you save them by destroying them. You don't just erase culture, You refine it. You don't just silence dissent. You burn away the sickness, and the fire doesn't stop. Once lit, it consumes more than its target. It consumes the soul of those who believe in it. Because when you convince yourself that harm is healing, you lose your ability to see pain as real. You see screams as part of the process. And the ash that falls, you call it progress. So ask yourself, how many times in history has cruelty survived not by hiding, but by dressing as medicine? How many flames were celebrated not because they destroyed, but because they were supposed to? Because in Europe's darkest hours, the most terrifying fire was the one lit by people who thought they were doing good. Execution is meant to end life, to punish, to eliminate, to make an example. But in the Europe of old, execution was not always treated as a crude act of justice. Sometimes it was framed as divine ritual, a moment not of punishment, but of sacrifice. In these moments, death became sacred, and violence was performed in the name of heaven. This is the paradox of sacred execution, when killing becomes holy and death is not shameful, but sanctified. One of the most disturbing examples is the execution of Joan of Arc in 1431. A peasant girl who claimed to hear the voice of God, she led French armies to critical victories during the 100 Years' War. But when captured by the English, she was tried for heresy and witchcraft. She was 19 years old. Her execution was meant to be a cleansing, a burning to purge her soul and protect the church, but she died crying out the name of Christ. And decades later, the same church that burned her declared her a saint. Her execution was sacred, both in condemnation and in redemption. The fire that killed her became the light of her canonization. Similar paradoxes play out across Europe's religious wars. During the Reformation, both Catholics and Protestants executed each other's followers, publicly, ceremonially. Heretics were burned or beheaded in front of crowds while priests offered final prayers. These weren't simple killings. They were performances of belief. The blade was wielded with a cross. Death became a liturgy. But sacred execution didn't require innocence. Often, even the guilty were led to their deaths with scripture on their lips and priests at their side. In medieval France and Spain, public hangings were often preceded by sermons. Executioners would ask the condemned to confess and accept God. Crowds were told they were witnessing not just justice, but salvation. A soul sent to God through suffering. Even kings and queens were not immune. Consider Charles I of England, executed in 1649 after a public trial. As he walked to the scaffold, he proclaimed his innocence and spoke of Christ's suffering. The crowd wept. Many believed they were witnessing not the fall of a tyrant, but the martyrdom of a divine right king. His blood, spilled in public, became a sacred text of its own, reinterpreted for generations. What makes sacred execution so chilling is the way it redefines power. It gives violence meaning. It turns brutality into ceremony. It gives the executioner moral absolution and the victim tragic immortality. Both become part of a larger divine story, one that justifies killing with theology. And perhaps even more terrifying, it confuses justice with holiness. The more sacred the death, the harder it becomes to question it. Who dares argue with God's will, with destiny, with the weight of scripture and ritual? The blade becomes clean because it is anointed. But here's the final twist. Sacred executions don't silence, they echo. Joan of Arc's death inspired rebellion. Charles the Moor's beheading helped birth new forms of government. Every sacred death leaves behind a paradox, a person destroyed, to preserve order, only to become a symbol that disrupts it forever. So ask yourself, when is justice truly justice? And when is it just a mask worn by ritual, designed to sanctify cruelty? Because in Europe's darkest chapters, some of the most venerated deaths were not accidents of injustice. They were designed that way. Justice is the cornerstone of civilization. It promises fairness, truth, and balance. But history tells a darker story of courtrooms that obeyed power instead of principle, of laws crafted to protect cruelty, and of punishments declared righteous, even as they shattered the innocent. This is the paradox of just injustice. When wrong is done legally, when cruelty wears the robes of the court, and when injustice is executed not in spite of the system, but because of it. Take the Dreyfus affair in 19th century France. Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer, was wrongfully convicted of treason. The evidence was flimsy, but anti-Semitic sentiment ran deep. The trial was official, the sentence carried out according to protocol. Newspapers celebrated the court's decision, and yet everything about it was false. Dreyfus was later exonerated, but only after years of imprisonment. The law had spoken, justice had not. Or look to the Salem witch trials, not in Europe, but built on a legal structure imported from Europe. Women and men were tried, found guilty, and executed based on spectral evidence, visions, dreams, rumors. The judges were respected. The process, formal. But justice, twisted beyond recognition. They didn't break the system. They used it exactly as it was designed. In Nazi Germany, injustice was codified into law. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship and criminalized ordinary human behavior. Every step of the Holocaust was shrouded in bureaucracy, forms, signatures, decrees. It wasn't chaos. It was chilling order. Everything that happened was legal, it just wasn't right. Even in Enlightenment-era Europe, the same thinkers who spoke of liberty and reason built legal systems that supported colonialism and slavery. In Britain, in France, in Portugal, entire empires were justified through contracts and charters. Oppression wasn't rogue. It was legalized. The laws didn't fail. They functioned exactly as designed, for the few against the many. The danger of just injustice is that it hides behind respectability. There's no mob, no chaos, just a judge in a wig, a document with a seal, a sentence read aloud while the world watches and nods. And the victims, they're told it's fair, that the law is neutral, that their pain is part of a process too grand to question. But the Egyptians, the Greeks, and even early Christians warned against this. They knew that law without morality is just a sword in a velvet sheath, that systems can be weaponized not in the name of cruelty, but in the name of order. This paradox persists today. We often believe that if a decision passes through courts, it must be just. That if a law exists, it must be right. But history says otherwise. It reminds us that some of the worst crimes came with signatures, that tyranny can wear a blindfold and call itself balanced. And yet, those who fought back did so not just with passion, but with truth. Zola's J'accuse shook France. The Dreyfus case became a rallying cry for human rights. And every time injustice was dressed in legal robes, someone stood up and pointed out, "This is not justice. This is a ritual of cruelty." So ask yourself, when you see a law passed or a sentence declared, does it serve truth or does it serve control? Because in Europe's darkest hours, the greatest threat wasn't lawlessness. It was the law itself, used with precision, with pride, and with no soul. The Enlightenment was meant to be Europe's great awakening. A time when reason triumphed over superstition, science eclipsed myth, and individual liberty became a sacred right. It promised light after centuries of darkness, and in many ways, it delivered. It gave rise to revolutionary ideals, public education, constitutional governance. But in the margins of this radiant vision, something darker grew. For every idea about equality, there were exclusions. For every discovery, a justification. For every progress, a price. This is the paradox of enlightened cruelty, when violence is done in the name of reason, when pain is inflicted not by ignorance, but by intellect. Take the French Revolution. It was birthed from Enlightenment ideals, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And yet, its streets ran red with blood. The guillotine became not just a tool of justice, but of terror. Thousands were executed in public squares, many without fair trial. And it wasn't framed as brutality, it was logical, clean, quick, efficient, a mathematically fair way to end lives for the greater good. Or consider how Enlightenment philosophers helped craft colonial justifications. Men like Voltaire and Hume, heroes of reason, wrote dismissively of African and indigenous peoples. Lesser minds, they said, less developed. This wasn't myth, this was science, or at least it pretended to be. Slavery, empire, and racial hierarchies were all justified by rational arguments. The more enlightened the mind, the more sophisticated the cruelty. Even in the age of medicine, cruelty wore a lab coat. Enlightenment-era scientists performed experiments on enslaved people, poor women, prisoners, all in the name of understanding the human body. Dissections were often done without consent. Pain became data. Lives became measurements. And always, the justification echoed, progress demands sacrifice. In Prussia, enlightened absolutism meant kings who claimed to rule with reason, while still crushing dissent and centralizing power. The logic was cold but persuasive. One wise ruler could be better than the chaos of democracy. But wisdom became dictatorship, reason became rule, and cruelty, if methodical enough, became acceptable. Even the arts weren't spared. The idea of cultural perfection led to the erasure of folk traditions, minority languages, and indigenous myths. They were seen as unrefined, unworthy. The Enlightenment didn't burn them, it ignored them. And in that silence, entire cultures vanished. What makes enlightened cruelty so dangerous is that it feels justified. There's no malice in the voice, just calm explanation, diagrams, charts, speeches. The pain is not denied, it's explained. And in that explanation, the soul is erased. It's a form of violence that doesn't shout or rage. It simply calculates. How many lives are worth this policy? How many deaths for this theory? What is the acceptable human cost of progress? That's why enlightened cruelty is harder to confront than barbarism. Barbarism is visible. Enlightened Cruelty is rational. It passes laws, it publishes papers, it builds monuments to itself. And when the victims scream, the response is quiet disapproval. You don't understand the bigger picture. But here's the truth. If your enlightenment requires erasure, it is not enlightenment. If your science needs silence, it is not knowledge. And if your reason demands blood, it is not wisdom. It is simply cruelty in a smarter mask. So ask yourself, when history calls something progress, whose pain is being ignored? When someone claims to be building a better world, for whom is it being built? Because in Europe's grandest age of light, some of the darkest shadows were cast, not by ignorance, but by intellect. Torture is usually thought of as something cruel, sadistic, and evil. But in the darkest chapters of European history, torture wasn't always hidden. It wasn't always condemned. In fact, it was sometimes considered holy. Not a crime, but a spiritual tool, a means to salvation. This is the paradox of holy torture, when pain is inflicted not in hatred, but in the name of love, of purity, of God. The medieval church believed that physical suffering could cleanse the soul, and when heresy became a threat to orthodoxy, torture was sanctioned as a method to bring the lost back into the light. The Inquisition is the most infamous example. Men in robes, sworn to Christ, would strap the accused into iron chairs, stretch them on racks, crush their fingers with cold steel, then ask gently, "Do you now see the truth?" They did not see this as brutality. They saw it as mercy. The sinner's body was punished so their soul might be saved. And if the body broke, better to suffer in life than burn in hell for eternity. Pain was a gift, a twisted form of grace. In Spain, in Portugal, and across the Holy Roman Empire, this logic spread like wildfire. Torture chambers were built beneath cathedrals, sacred, spaces turned into instruments of fear. And always the torturers claimed, "This is for your own good." Even outside the church, this logic seeped into politics. In 17th century England, during the reign of James I, torture was used not just to extract information, but to prove divine order. The gunpowder plotters, for example, were not only interrogated, but brutalized to showcase what happened to those who dared oppose God's appointed king. And it wasn't just the powerful doing the torturing. In villages across Europe, ordinary people participated in witch trials, flogged their neighbors, crushed the legs of midwives and widows, all under the belief that they were doing God's work. The pain inflicted was seen as holy duty, not cruelty. But what makes holy torture so horrifying isn't just the pain, it's the conviction behind it. The torturer doesn't see himself as a monster. He sees himself as righteous. He does not laugh. He prays. He doesn't scream. He listens for the confession. And when the victim breaks, he does not gloat. He thanks the heavens. Because when torture becomes holy, morality collapses. There is no room for doubt, no space for mercy. The pain becomes sacred, untouchable. That's what makes it so dangerous. Regular cruelty can be stopped, but cruelty believed to be good, that spreads like fire in dry grass. And in Europe's darkest eras, it was this sacred cruelty that endured the longest. Even today, its echoes remain in ideologies that claim righteousness while crushing dissent, in systems that justify suffering by claiming it brings truth, in people who harm others not because they enjoy it, but because they believe they must. So ask yourself, is the worst violence the one done in anger, or the one done in love? Because in the heart of old Europe, some of the most horrifying screams rose from chambers where the torturer whispered prayers and called it salvation. Empires are often imagined as vast, sprawling powers, marked by armies, flags, and conquests. Their borders are drawn on maps, their rulers cast in bronze, their capitals built in marble. But not all empires take such visible shape. Some do not need legions or land. Some conquer through systems, symbols, and silence. This is the paradox of the invisible empire. Domination without occupation, control without presence, power that expands through minds, not just borders. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered what we now call the Middle Ages. But while the Roman legions withdrew, the Roman idea never left. Its laws, architecture, language, and symbols persisted, reborn through the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, and Renaissance humanism. Rome fell, yet ruled still. A ghost empire, intact in imagination. Or look to the power of the Catholic Church during the medieval period. Its physical territory was small, but its spiritual empire stretched across kingdoms. A pope in Rome could command kings, launch wars, or excommunicate rulers into isolation. No need for armies, no need for walls, just belief, an empire built in the invisible space between mind and ritual. In the British Empire, long after colonies declared independence, English continued to dominate in education, law, and commerce. The sun may have set on the Union Jack, but the empire persisted in institutions, habits, and language. It taught its subjects to carry the empire inside them, long after the soldiers were gone. Even Nazi Germany, before its full territorial expansion, exercised invisible control. Through propaganda, youth indoctrination, and cultural manipulation, it built an empire in the minds of its people. Flags waved before borders moved. The soil was not first, the thought was. In Eastern Europe under Soviet influence, whole nations functioned like puppets. Governments appeared independent, but real decisions came from Moscow. It was not always visible to the public eye, yet the empire dictated speech, economy, and ideology. The red flag didn't need to fly everywhere, because it flew in policy, in fear, in silence. What makes invisible empires so powerful is that they don't need force. They are efficient, sustainable, hard to detect. A child taught to love their oppressor no longer needs to be conquered. A people made to think the empire is their natural state won't rebel. And this kind of empire often lives on after its collapse. Statues fall, but values remain. Borders change, but language persists. And the colonized, long after freedom, still question their own culture, identity, worth. That's not an accident, that's design. This paradox forces us to rethink what empire really is. It's not just land, it's influence. It's not just battles, it's belief systems. It's not just flags, it's the inability to imagine life without them. And perhaps most chilling of all, invisible empires are harder to overthrow. How do you revolt against something you cannot see? How do you fight a map drawn in your own brain? So ask yourself, what empires still live inside us? What voices are we obeying that no longer rule, but still echo? Because in the long, dark corridors of European history, The most enduring empires were not always those that marched, but those that whispered. We often imagine collapse as sudden, cataclysmic events, cities in flames, kingdoms falling overnight. But history tells a quieter story. Some of the most devastating collapses aren't physical at all. They're moral. They happen when a society no longer knows what is right, only what is useful. This is the paradox of moral collapse. When a civilization continues to build, govern, and function, even as its conscience disappears. Consider Nazi Germany. Trains ran on time. Schools taught math. Scientists made breakthroughs in rocketry and medicine. Bureaucracies processed forms, balanced books, stamped approvals. It was a society functioning with brutal efficiency, while millions were being murdered. There was order, but no morality. Civilization had survived. Conscience had not. Or take Vichy France, the puppet regime that collaborated with Hitler. French officials, intellectuals, and even clergy justified their cooperation with logic, survival, realism, patriotism. They did not see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as practical. The line between good and bad was blurred, then erased, and a nation that once gave the world liberté, égalité, fraternité turned inward and abandoned its own. In the centuries before, the Atlantic slave trade was a normal part of European economics. Ships were built, ports expanded, taxes collected. The system enriched nations like Britain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. Laws were written to regulate the trade. Ministers blessed it. Banks invested in it. Families built wealth from it. Slavery wasn't hidden, it was respected business, and that's what made it monstrous. Not that it happened in darkness, but that it happened in plain sight, with moral blindness worn like a badge. Even in the Dutch Golden Age, a time hailed for its art, science, and commerce, the wealth that poured into Amsterdam was soaked in colonial blood. People praised their growing cities, their freedom from Spanish rule, their flourishing merchant class, while ignoring the suffering that funded it. The society looked forward, its ethics stayed behind. What makes moral collapse so terrifying is its subtlety. People rarely notice it happening. It's not announced with gunshots. It begins with exceptions, justifications, little compromises, a priest who looks the other way, a judge who bends the law, a newspaper that avoids hard truths, a teacher who skips that part of the lesson. Soon a generation grows up not knowing what decency looks like, not because they're evil, but because no one taught them. And when conscience collapses, the body of society keeps moving. It may even look healthier, but the heart has stopped. This is how genocides happen, how war crimes are signed into policy, how people live next door to horror and do nothing, not out of cruelty, but out of numbness. A numbness that's inherited, disguised, rationalized. And the collapse isn't just national, it's personal. A man who once believed in fairness takes a better paying job in a corrupt system. A woman who once marched in protest signs a paper that harms others, just to keep her home. They're not monsters. They're tired. They're afraid. They're realistic. That's the danger. Moral collapse doesn't require villains, only resignation. So ask yourself, what are you tolerating because it's normal? What compromises feel harmless until they're too large to undo? Because in Europe's grand history, the worst collapses didn't always leave ruins. They left survivors, walking through streets that still stood. living in houses that still shone, but carrying inside them a silence where their conscience used to be. Civilization is meant to be the great divider between humans and beasts. It promises law over chaos, culture over cruelty, structure over savagery. But what happens when those very symbols of civilization, parliaments, libraries, courts, and cathedrals, become the tools of calculated inhumanity? This is the paradox of civilized savagery. When society's most refined systems become mechanisms of violence, and the most brutal acts are committed not in darkness, but beneath chandeliers, in polished halls, by men in powdered wigs. Take the British Empire, praised for its literature, science, and legal innovation. Yet it enacted brutal punishments across its colonies, often under the guise of discipline and order. In India, the empire suppressed uprisings with methods designed to terrify, not just defeat. Rebels were tied to cannons and blasted apart. Villages were burned to restore peace. This wasn't chaos, it was protocol. British officers kept journals, documented executions, and filed reports about how order had been efficiently restored. In Belgium's Congo Free State, King Leopold II never personally visited the land he ruled, but under his name, millions died. The administration was elegant in structure. Reports were filed, performance tracked, rubber quotas enforced. And when villagers failed to meet their quotas, their hands were cut off. Children were mutilated, entire families destroyed. It wasn't called savagery, it was called commerce. The French Third Republic, a self-declared beacon of liberty and reason, waged colonial wars in Algeria and Vietnam, using torture and concentration camps while quoting Rousseau. In Algeria, civilians were arrested en masse, interrogated with electric shocks and beatings, all while the metropole insisted it was teaching the colonized to be civilized. Even the Spanish Inquisition, often remembered as a fanatic relic, was carried out through highly organized tribunals. It wasn't mobs with torches, it was clerks, interrogators, and scribes. Heretics were processed, questioned, and sentenced with ritualistic precision. Savagery didn't erupt in the absence of civilization. It evolved within it. What makes civilized savagery so dangerous is its disguise. Brutality that wears the robes of justice is harder to recognize. When a beating is delivered by a man in uniform with legal justification, when a village is wiped out by an army with a flag and anthem, the violence becomes invisible to those who benefit from it. It's not seen as evil, it's seen as policy. This is not accidental. Civilization gives brutality a script. It teaches it to speak politely, to file paperwork, to call itself necessary. It turns conquest into enlightenment, imprisonment into protection, theft into trade. It doesn't need to shout, it just needs to function. And this is why European history is filled with atrocities committed not in moments of collapse, but at the height of societal order. The Atlantic slave trade was administered by ports, customs officials, bankers, and shipping schedules. It was not chaos. It was logistics. Even the Holocaust was not born of disorder. It was engineered by bureaucrats, enforced by trained soldiers, and rationalized by legal scholars. Civilization didn't fail to prevent it. It enabled it with chilling efficiency. Ask yourself, what makes an action civilized? Is it the language it uses, the clothes it wears, the paperwork it generates? Because in the pages of history, the worst savagery is often not committed by the untamed, but by the highly educated, the well-dressed, the ideologically certain. They write poetry, they build museums, and they send death with a signature. So, the next time we admire a monument or read of an empire's greatness, we must ask, at what cost did this refinement come? What rivers of blood run beneath these marble floors? Because the paradox of civilized savagery is not that civilization suppresses brutality, but that it learns how to organize it beautifully. Loyalty is held up as a supreme virtue. We teach it in families, demand it in politics, reward it in armies. To be loyal is to be trustworthy, steadfast, unbreakable. But what happens when loyalty itself becomes the weapon? When standing by someone means standing against what's right? This is the paradox of loyal betrayal. When those who are most loyal are the very ones who uphold corruption, silence truth, and become complicit, not in spite of their loyalty, but because of it. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of Europe's fascist regimes. In Nazi Germany, millions of ordinary citizens didn't join the SS or march in parades out of hatred. They did so out of loyalty. Loyalty to the state, loyalty to an idea of national rebirth. They turned in neighbors, closed their eyes to disappearances, followed orders. Not because they were monsters, but because they had been taught that loyalty was noble, and in doing so, they became betrayers of humanity. In Stalin's Soviet-aligned Eastern Europe, similar patterns emerged. Informants in East Germany's Stasi didn't see themselves as traitors. They believed they were being loyal to socialism, to the party, to peace. But this loyalty required them to spy on their own children, report on colleagues, and assist in the destruction of innocent lives. They were faithful servants of a machine that consumed its own. And in monarchies across medieval and early modern Europe, loyalty to crown often meant betrayal of the people. The nobility, sworn to serve their king, collected crushing taxes, enforced cruel punishments, and carried out purges, all while claiming moral righteousness. They were not criminals, they were loyalists. Even within religious institutions, the church demanded unwavering allegiance. When reformers questioned indulgences or papal power, it was not seen as a debate, it was heresy. To be loyal to God, one had to obey men, and in doing so, many betrayed their own conscience, watching silently as others were burned, tortured, or excommunicated. What makes loyal betrayal so dangerous is its emotional depth. Loyalty isn't just obedience, it's personal. It appeals to love, to pride, to a sense of belonging. When a state or ideology wraps itself in loyalty, it gains not just control, but the willing sacrifice of its followers. People will justify anything, suppress any doubt, turn against their own, for fear of being disloyal. And history has shown us how often this leads to tragedy. In World War I, entire generations of young men marched into slaughter, not because they believed in the cause, but because they felt loyal to their flag, their brothers, their homeland. Questioning the war was betrayal, but staying loyal meant dying in mud-soaked trenches for empires that collapsed anyway. In Spain's civil war, families were torn apart. Brothers fought on opposite sides. Loyalty to ideology, to Franco, or the Republic trumped blood, and the result was betrayal on both sides, of each other, of shared history, of what it meant to be Spanish. Even in modern democracies, the machinery of loyal betrayal remains. Whistleblowers are punished. Journalists are silenced. Citizens are told that questioning authority is dangerous, that speaking up is disloyal, But staying silent, going along, that is what allows corruption to flourish. So ask yourself, what do we betray in the name of loyalty? What do we excuse, ignore, or endorse just because we feel bound to a leader, a cause, a tribe? Because true loyalty should never demand silence in the face of injustice. It should never ask us to trade truth for comfort or conscience for unity. And yet throughout Europe's darkest history, betrayal often came not from enemies, but from those who were most loyal. Truth is often imagined as something permanent, etched into stone, immune to time, waiting to be discovered. But history tells a different story. In Europe's grand narrative, truths have not just been buried, they've been rewritten, erased, or conveniently forgotten. This is the paradox of forgotten truth, when the most essential facts are lost not by accident, but by design. When forgetting becomes a tool of power, and ignorance is cultivated like a crop. Consider the fate of the Cathars in medieval France. They were a religious group who challenged the Catholic Church's teachings. For this, they were declared heretics. Entire cities were massacred, libraries burned, records destroyed, and within a few decades, their culture had all but vanished. Not just their bodies were killed, but their version of the truth was erased from memory. The Roman Empire was notorious for damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. If an emperor fell from favor, his statues were smashed, his name chiseled off monuments, his image defaced. To forget someone was the ultimate punishment, worse than death, because it denied even legacy. The empire controlled history by controlling what could be remembered. In Spain, during the Reconquista and the Inquisition, vast amounts of knowledge, particularly from the Islamic Golden Age, were lost. Muslim libraries in Granada and Cordoba, once among the richest in the world, were burned. Their scientific advancements, philosophical works, and translations of Greek classics vanished. What Europe would later rediscover during the Renaissance had first been forgotten, on purpose. Colonial powers rewrote the histories of the lands they conquered. In Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, indigenous histories were dismissed as myth or oral nonsense. European scholars discovered things locals had known for centuries, and entire civilizations were branded as primitive simply because they didn't fit Western categories. The truth wasn't unknown, it was unwanted. Even within Europe itself, revolutions brought purges, not just of people, but of narratives. After the fall of the French monarchy, the revolution created a new calendar, erased Christian holidays, renamed streets, and attempted to rewrite time itself. The past had to be forgotten so that the new truth could reign unchallenged. This wasn't always done through fire and force. Sometimes it was done with ink and silence. History books written after World War I often downplayed colonial violence. They spoke of treaties and alliances, but rarely of how Europe had carved up the world. With maps and rifles, they spoke of noble causes, not the lies that sent millions to die in trenches. In Eastern Europe, the shifting borders after World War II created entire regions where people no longer knew which flag to salute. In Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics, histories were rewritten with every regime. One generation grew up hearing one truth, the next another. Each flag brought its own textbook. And of course, Holocaust denial, still alive in some corners of Europe, is the most grotesque form of forgotten truth. Despite mountains of evidence, some still try to erase the memory of what happened. Not because they don't know the truth, but because they don't want it to be true. What makes forgotten truth so insidious is that it hides in plain sight. The erasure happens slowly, through censored textbooks, biased museums, and selective anniversaries. The monuments we build are just as revealing as the ones we let crumble. So ask yourself, what truths have we forgotten? Not because we couldn't remember, but because it was easier not to. What facts lie beneath the foundations of our cities, ignored by the plaques above? Because in the history of Europe, forgetting wasn't just an accident, it was a weapon. And the more polished the lie, the more thoroughly the truth had to be buried. Freedom is a word that has inspired revolutions, toppled empires, and redefined nations. It is painted on flags, sung in anthems, and carved into marble. But what happens when the pursuit of freedom leads not to liberation, but to a new kind of confinement? This is the paradox of freedom's prison. When the promise of liberty becomes the justification for oppression, and when those who fight for freedom end up building their own cages. Start with the French Revolution, an uprising that began with cries for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The monarchy was overthrown, the Bastille stormed, and a republic proclaimed. But within just a few years, the revolution devoured its own children. The reign of terror saw thousands executed in the name of freedom. Dissenters were labeled enemies of the people. The guillotine became the symbol not of justice, but of fear. Freedom had become so sacred that questioning it became treason. In the name of liberty, liberty died. In Soviet Russia, the Bolsheviks promised freedom from the chains of capitalism, from imperial tyranny, from inequality, and yet, under Stalin, the very structures meant to free the people, collective ownership, workers' councils, revolutionary justice, became the tools of control. Freedom became surveillance. Dissent was crushed, and the Gulag archipelago swallowed millions. They had escaped the Tsar's prison only to enter a larger one built in the name of progress. Even in post-revolutionary Europe, new democracies often carried the ghosts of the regimes they replaced. In Italy, Mussolini rose to power by promising to restore freedom and national pride. He was cheered as a savior, but he quickly dissolved opposition parties, silenced the press, and turned the nation into a fascist state. The illusion of freedom was enough to convince many to surrender it willingly. In colonial contexts, the word freedom became dangerously twisted. British officials in India spoke of civilizing the natives and giving them the tools for self-rule someday. But in practice, they ruled with iron fists, censored press, crushed protests, and gunned down unarmed civilians, all under the pretense that freedom must be earned slowly and only through obedience. Religious reformations in Europe too offer troubling examples. Martin Luther's defiance of the Catholic Church was framed as a quest for spiritual freedom. And yet, in Protestant states, new restrictions arose on books, on behavior, on worship. The hierarchy changed, but the control remained. Belief was liberated, but people were still bound. Even modern liberal democracies are not immune. In the name of freedom of speech or national security, oppressive laws have been passed. Surveillance expands, borders tighten, minorities are scapegoated. The rhetoric is always the same. We must do this to preserve our freedom. But what kind of freedom requires constant policing to maintain? This paradox is so powerful because it feels noble. We want to be free. We fear losing it. And so we build walls, not just against enemies, but around ourselves. We imprison others for threatening our ideals. We imprison ourselves in the name of safety, and often we don't see the bars until it's too late. The prison is made of familiar things: patriotism, pride, ideology. The doors are open, but we are afraid to walk out, afraid of what freedom, without control, might actually look like. Ask yourself, have we mistaken control for freedom? Have we accepted chains simply because we were told they were self-imposed? Because in Europe's history, freedom has not always meant open fields and unchained minds. Sometimes it meant a tighter grip, a louder anthem, and a deeper silence. And the tragedy is not just that freedom was lost. It's that it was given away out of fear that someone else might misuse it. Genocide is often remembered as the ultimate evil, a crime beyond politics, beyond ideology, beyond excuse. And yet, again and again, throughout European history, mass extermination was not only tolerated, but dressed in the language of morality, destiny, and even progress. This is the paradox of noble genocide, when the most horrifying acts of violence are committed not by monsters, but by men who believe they are saving the world. Take the Spanish conquest of the Americas, where millions of indigenous people were wiped out through violence, disease, and forced labor. This was not merely a campaign of greed, it was justified as a holy mission. Spanish conquistadors and priests claimed they were saving souls, bringing civilization, carrying the cross. Slaughter was framed as salvation. The mass killing of cultures was not a crime, it was a service to God. In France, during the Revolution, the government unleashed a campaign of extermination in the Vendée region, where counter-revolutionaries and royalists resisted. Entire villages were burned, women and children drowned en masse in rivers. But this was not called genocide. Revolutionary leaders declared it a necessary cleansing of reactionary elements. They weren't committing evil, they were purifying. The Republic. The Nazi regime is perhaps the most extreme and chilling example. The Holocaust was not carried out in chaos. It was systematic, industrialized, and bureaucratically clean. It was done in the name of racial purity, of science, of national renewal. Doctors signed off on experiments. Professors taught the theories. Soldiers followed orders with quiet conviction. The genocide of Jews, Roma, disabled people, and others was seen by its architects not as brutality, but as biology. They were making the world better. British imperialism too carried echoes of noble genocide. In Ireland, the Great Famine was allowed to unfold not just through mismanagement, but through active policy. Food was exported, aid was withheld, all in the name of free market principles. The Irish were seen as lazy, overpopulated, and backward. Letting them starve was not genocide. It was seen as necessary evolution, a painful but civilizing process. In the Balkans, during the collapse of Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansing campaigns were justified by invoking ancient grievances, divine will, and the dream of national unity. Churches blessed soldiers. Politicians spoke of historical destiny. The murders of neighbors were framed as justice for ancestors. Every massacre was made to feel righteous. What binds these horrors together is not just the violence, but the belief behind it. The killers did not always see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as instruments of history, of faith, of truth. They spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of necessity. And that's what makes noble genocide so terrifying. It doesn't require hatred, only conviction. You don't need chaos, only paperwork. It can be done with hymns playing, with laws in place, with uniforms pressed and polished. This paradox also survives in silence. Museums across Europe are filled with artifacts stolen from cultures that were destroyed. Their stories are told as discovery, not desecration. Streets are still named after men who led campaigns of extermination. Statues still stand of those who built empires on broken bodies. Europe rarely remembers its genocides as genocide unless it happens outside its borders. The killing of Armenians, of Herero people in Namibia, of Algerians in the name of pacification, all are softened in textbooks if mentioned at all. Words like unrest, conflict, or unfortunate episodes are used. The truth is hidden behind manners. So ask yourself, what beliefs are we still clinging to that once justified mass murder? Whose deaths are still seen as regrettable but necessary? Because genocide doesn't always come wearing rags and waving knives. Sometimes it comes in robes, with parchment, quoting scripture or science. And the most terrifying genocide is the one that people still believe was a good idea. When we imagine chaos, we often picture anarchy, fires in the streets, mobs breaking windows, regimes collapsing under the weight of confusion. But history tells another tale. Sometimes chaos wears a uniform. Sometimes disorder is administered from a desk, and sometimes the most disorienting horrors unfold with perfect organization. This is the paradox of orderly chaos, when the systems meant to maintain order become the very engines of collapse, when bureaucracy becomes blind, when rules replace reason, and when the structure itself ensures destruction. Nowhere is this more vividly illustrated than in Nazi Germany. The Holocaust was not a riot or a breakdown of civilization. It was a carefully planned genocide carried out through trains, ledgers, factory schedules, and coded language. Camps like Auschwitz were engineered with precision. Every death was filed, every shipment logged. Chaos wasn't the absence of order. It was the result of its cold perfection. There was no need for screams in the street. The paperwork screamed for them. In the Soviet Union, under Stalin, chaos took on the form of administrative madness. The Great Purge saw hundreds of thousands arrested, tortured, and executed, often based on quotas. NKVD agents were told how many enemies to find, whether they existed or not. Accusations were vague, confessions forced, trials non-existent, but all of it passed through official channels. Names were typed, reports stamped. No one was responsible, and everyone was complicit. It wasn't a mob, it was a machine. The Austro-Hungarian Empire offers another example. In its later years, it became a parody of itself. Dozens of languages spoken, endless titles and ministries, overlapping laws. Its bureaucracy was so vast and rigid that even minor reforms took decades. This dysfunction helped set the stage for World War I. Assassinations, alliances, ultimatums, all spun from an empire tangled in its own web of rules. The empire collapsed not from revolution, but from inertia. A slow-motion chaos wrapped in protocol. Even in the United Kingdom during the Irish famine, chaos unfolded in an orderly fashion. Relief boards were formed, policies debated, papers circulated, and yet, as bureaucracy argued, people starved. Rules prevented urgent food distribution. Procedures stalled rescue efforts. The system wasn't broken. It It was working exactly as designed. And that was the problem. In post-war Yugoslavia, order was imposed across diverse ethnic and religious groups. Federal unity was enforced by tight control, surveillance, and censorship. For decades, it seemed stable. But the moment that structure cracked, chaos erupted, not because it was unexpected, but because it had been stored, building up beneath decades of suppressed tension. The order had held everything in place, but resolved nothing. When it failed violently. What makes orderly chaos so sinister is how reasonable it seems. People following rules, systems working, no alarms, no revolutions. But underneath, the system begins to eat itself. Laws contradict each other. Orders are obeyed without question. No one stops to ask why. No one wants to be the crack in the dam. So the chaos grows quietly until it bursts. Europe has long prided itself on its structure, from Roman law to Napoleonic codes, from royal courts to socialist councils. But these systems have also failed to recognize when their own order was creating collapse. The refugee crises of the 20th and 21st centuries are another example. Thousands die at sea or are held in legal limbo, not because there are no systems in place, but because those systems are deliberately paralyzed. Asylum applications are denied due to technicalities. People are shuffled between jurisdictions. Everyone follows the rules, and no one takes responsibility. Ask yourself, is order always a solution, or can it be a disguise? Because in Europe's darkest hours, the clipboard was often more dangerous than the sword, the uniformed clerk more destructive than the marching rebel. Chaos doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the corridors of power, dressed in perfect calm. War is often painted in broad strokes, heroes and villains, glory and defeat, good and evil. But peel back the propaganda, and history reveals something far more unsettling. The people who kill the most are often the ones who never wanted to. They are not sadists or zealots. They are reluctant, conflicted, broken, and they kill anyway. This is the paradox of reluctant slaughter, when those who carry out the bloodshed do so not out of passion, but out of duty, fear, or inertia. It is when the machinery of violence is sustained not by hatred, but by hesitation. In World War I, this paradox was everywhere. The trenches of Europe were filled not with ideologues, but with farmers, teachers, and sons who had never fired a gun before conscription. Letters home from British, French, and German soldiers echo the same sentiment. I don't want to be here. Yet they stayed, they killed, and they died. The war dragged on, not because anyone truly believed in it, but because no one could imagine how to stop it. Millions were slaughtered in battles no one believed in. The Balkan Wars of the 1990s offer another chilling glimpse. Villagers who had lived side by side for generations suddenly turned against each other. Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks were handed weapons and told to fight for survival. Many hesitated, some cried, and yet they followed orders. Ethnic cleansing was often carried out by neighbors, former friends, people who claimed they had no choice. They did not burn with hatred, but they still lit the fires. During the Rwandan genocide, European powers, particularly France and Belgium, played a background role in training militias and shaping the environment of ethnic tension. But when the killing began, the international response was paralyzed by procedures. Western diplomats admitted in interviews years later that they could have intervened, but didn't. Not because they wanted the bloodshed, but because they feared the political consequences. Reluctance became complicity. Even in Nazi Germany, not all members of the Wehrmacht or SS were true believers. Many soldiers expressed private doubts about the regime. Some tried to justify their role by saying they were just following orders, but the slaughter continued. Historians now agree that one of the key reasons the Holocaust was so efficiently carried out was that so many people were willing to reluctantly comply rather than openly refuse. And perhaps one of the most disturbing cases comes from France's role in the Algerian War. French soldiers, many of them conscripts, were ordered to suppress the independence movement. Torture, executions, and disappearances became daily occurrences. In diaries and testimonies, soldiers confessed their horror. Some even begged to be reassigned, yet they remained. They did the killing, because to defy orders meant becoming a traitor. Their loyalty outlived their conscience. What makes reluctant slaughter so terrifying is its banality. It suggests that evil doesn't always look like a monster. It can look like an ordinary man, unsure, tired, afraid, but still holding a gun, still pulling a trigger. It forces us to question how many atrocities happened, not because people wanted them to, but because they didn't know how to say no. Because when institutions ask for violence and society applauds obedience, the path of least resistance becomes a blood-soaked road. Ask yourself, how many times in history has hesitation turned into horror? How many people have died because others were too scared to disobey? This is not just a warning about the past. It is a map of how ordinary people become executioners, not with joy, but with quiet regret. Because the most dangerous killer is not the one who wants to kill. It's the one who doesn't, but still does. Surveillance often conjures images of blinking cameras, listening devices, shadowy agents in trench coats. We imagine it as intrusive, obvious, a violation that makes itself known. But the most dangerous kind of surveillance doesn't shout, it whispers, it watches without being seen, and punishes without ever needing to act. This is the paradox of silent surveillance. When control is achieved not through visible force, but through the possibility of being watched. When fear is internalized so deeply that people censor themselves, turning their own minds into prisons. In East Germany, the Stasi perfected this art. At its peak, it employed hundreds of thousands of informants, including neighbors, teachers, even spouses. But what made the system truly terrifying wasn't just how many people were watching. It was that no one knew who was. Every interaction could be a trap. Every joke could be reported. People began to whisper in their own homes, to keep diaries in code, to distrust even their children. The result? A society where resistance became unthinkable, not because tanks rolled through the streets, but because minds were already occupied. The Stasi didn't need to kick down every door. They just needed you to believe they might. This wasn't new. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church employed a spiritual version of silent surveillance. Through confession, excommunication, and the ever-present threat of hell, thoughts themselves became dangerous. Questioning dogma, even in private, could be deemed heresy. The Inquisition used informants and rumors to root out dissent, and because sins could be punished even without witnesses, the faithful learned to fear their own doubts. In Nazi Germany, loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced through culture. Radio broadcasts, school books, posters, and youth organizations created a self-monitoring society. Children were encouraged to report disloyal parents. Neighbors filed anonymous complaints. The Gestapo wasn't large enough to monitor everyone, so it turned citizens into its eyes and ears. People kept quiet not because they saw Gestapo agents on every corner, but because they didn't know who was listening. In Francoist Spain, surveillance was folded into everyday life. Informants worked in churches, markets, workplaces. Whispers of disloyalty to the regime could result in arrest, torture, or worse. But again, the power lay not in overt terror, it lay in suggestion, in the quiet conversation that suddenly stopped when someone entered the room. In the long silence after a question was asked, the regime didn't need to shout. The silence was louder. Even colonial regimes employed silent surveillance. In British India, dissent was often managed not by guns, but by spies embedded in local communities, by censorship laws, by psychological pressure. British officials cultivated an image of omniscience, that any revolutionary act would be known before it even began. In many cases, they didn't stop uprisings by force. They stopped them in people's minds. In modern Europe, the paradox continues. Surveillance technology has become more sophisticated. Facial recognition, internet tracking, metadata collection. But the old patterns remain. Most people censor themselves online, not because someone is visibly watching, but because someone could be. Algorithms shape what we see, predict what we think, and quietly reinforce what we believe. Dissent still exists, but it is shadowed by hesitation. And that hesitation is a kind of control. Silent surveillance is the ultimate soft power. It doesn't crush resistance. It makes resistance seem irrational. Why speak out if you'll be flagged? Why dissent if it might cost your job, your visa, your reputation? Ask yourself, who watches you without watching? What thoughts have you buried, not because they are wrong, but because they are unsafe? Because in Europe's darkest moments, the most oppressive regimes didn't need to be loud. They just needed you to listen to your own fear, and when fear becomes constant, when silence becomes instinct, surveillance no longer needs watchers, it just needs you. In a rational world, madness is hidden. It's something to be treated, corrected, kept away from power. But Europe's history tells a more haunting tale. One where madness was not only tolerated in its rulers, but glorified, obeyed, and even worshipped. When the crown rested on a broken mind, the damage was not private. It was national. It was generational. This is the paradox of crowned madness. When the person entrusted with order and judgment is the least sane of all, and yet remains untouchable, because their madness is clothed in authority. Take King Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. He believed he was made of glass, feared breaking into shards, and would refuse to be touched. He sometimes ran through corridors howling like a wolf. His court knew of his condition, but he remained king. His madness led to civil war, a power vacuum, and eventually the fall of France into English hands during the 100 Years' War. But no one dared remove him. The crown made the madness sacred. In Spain, Joanna of Castile, later called Joanna the Mad, was locked away for decades. She suffered severe mental breakdowns after the death of her husband, carrying his coffin from town to town, speaking to it, refusing to bury it. Her madness was exploited by her father, husband, and son, each using her condition to justify their own power, while keeping her imprisoned yet technically queen. Madness in this case became a useful tool, not a disqualification. Even more disturbing is the case of Emperor Nero of Rome. Known for his paranoia, cruelty, and theatrical excess, Nero watched Rome burn and blamed the Christians. He executed his own mother. He forced senators to commit suicide. He built golden palaces in the ruins of the city. But as emperor, his madness was protected by ceremony and myth. Only when his power weakened did his insanity become a liability. Until then, Rome bowed to him, mad or not. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king, bankrupted his kingdom building elaborate castles and opera houses for his idol, Richard Wagner. He avoided court meetings, refused governance, and lived in fantasy. Eventually, he was declared insane and removed, only to die under mysterious circumstances soon after. His madness was ridiculed in life, but celebrated in death. Today, tourists flock to his castles, unaware that they were monuments to a man who had retreated entirely from reality. What makes crowned madness so dangerous is not the madness itself, but the reverence around it. Monarchies thrived on divine right, the belief that kings ruled by the will of God. To question a mad king was to question heaven, and so madness wore velvet, sat on thrones, gave orders no one dared disobey. In Tsarist Russia, Ivan the Terrible lived up to his name. He murdered his own heir in a fit of rage. He alternated between mystical visions and violent purges. He created a secret police, the Oprichniki, who terrorized the populace with torture and executions. And yet, he was considered holy. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized him as a protector of faith. His madness was folded into his legend, chaos masquerading as righteousness. But crowned madness wasn't limited to monarchs. In Nazi Germany, Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior, reliance on pseudoscience, and obsession with mystical ideas were clear signs of psychological decline. Yet his inner circle protected and enabled him. His rants became law. His paranoia became policy. His instability cost tens of millions of lives. But he was obeyed until the very end. The paradox deepens when you realize how often the people around the crown knew, but said nothing. Madness was whispered about, joked about in private, studied behind closed doors, but never challenged publicly, because the system was built to serve the crown, not sanity. Ask yourself, how many wars began with a delusion? How many lives were lost because no one could say, the king is unwell? Because in Europe's long and bloody past, madness didn't always wear rags. Sometimes it wore gold, and the crown, once placed, was almost impossible to remove, even if it rested on a broken mind. When we think of corruption, we picture hidden deals, secret bribes, backroom favors. We imagine it operating outside the law, infecting systems from the shadows. But what if corruption isn't always illegal? What if the law itself becomes the tool of rot? This is the paradox of legal corruption. When injustice is written into legislation, when exploitation wears the mask of legality, and when the very systems meant to protect the people become the machinery of their oppression. In Nazi Germany, the Holocaust wasn't carried out in lawlessness. It was codified, justified, and signed into existence. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of citizenship, banned intermarriage, and legalized discrimination. Every bureaucratic act, from the seizure of property to forced deportations, was stamped and filed as lawful. Germany remained a nation of rules. It's just that the rules had been poisoned. Similarly, in fascist Italy, Mussolini's regime passed legislation that suppressed political opponents, censored the press, and outlawed labor strikes, all under the claim of maintaining order. The courts functioned. The police followed procedure. The state appeared structured and legitimate. But beneath the surface, legality had become the weapon of dictatorship. Tsarist Russia, before the revolution, was infamous for its dual system of justice, one for the nobility and another for peasants. Serfs had no real legal standing. They could be punished, sold, or abused at the discretion of their landlords. This wasn't a failure of the law, it was the law. Oppression didn't need to hide, it wore a judge's robe. During the Irish penal laws, Britain systematically restricted the rights of Catholics in Ireland through legislation. They couldn't vote, hold office, own firearms, or even educate their children freely. Every aspect of Irish life was regulated by law designed to subjugate. This wasn't a rogue abuse of power. It was parliamentary procedure. In Vichy France, during World War II, collaboration with Nazi Germany was institutionalized. Anti-Semitic laws were passed by French lawmakers, not by German occupiers. Deportations were managed by French police. The French legal system didn't resist occupation. It enabled it. Citizens were handed over not by criminals, but by clerks, judges, and lawyers obeying the law of the land. But legal corruption isn't always dramatic or genocidal. In post-war Europe, numerous regimes passed laws protecting war criminals under the guise of national reconciliation. In Spain, following Franco's death, the 1977 amnesty law prevented prosecution of crimes committed during the dictatorship. Torturers, murderers, and collaborators were shielded, not by evasion, but by legal design. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the layers of red tape and endless regulation created a system so convoluted that only the powerful could navigate it. Laws were twisted to serve the wealthy and connected. Minorities were often excluded or ignored. Corruption didn't flourish in the shadows. It was built into the system. It was a feature, not a bug. Even democratic states have struggled with this paradox. In modern Europe, powerful elites have used loopholes, tax havens, and financial legislation to legally avoid billions in taxes, while ordinary citizens face austerity and shrinking services. The laws are followed. The ethics are not. Legal corruption thrives in the illusion of legitimacy, because if the law says it's right, who are we to question it? When courts function, when votes are cast, when papers are stamped, it becomes difficult to see that justice has been hollowed out. Ask yourself, how many evils have been carried out behind a desk with a pen instead of a gun? How many systems have convinced their citizens that suffering is simply how things work? Because in the history of Europe, the law has often been used not to restrain power, but to disguise it. And the most dangerous form of corruption is the one that tells you it's doing the right thing. Prosperity is supposed to bring comfort. Wealth is supposed to relieve suffering. Yet again and again in Europe's long history, the accumulation of gold led not to happiness, but to horror. The cities grew taller, the treasuries heavier, but the people beneath them grew more desperate. This is the paradox of golden misery. When immense wealth not only fails to prevent suffering, it creates it. When riches become a source of rot and the golden age is built on human agony. Start with the Dutch Golden Age. The Netherlands in the 17th century was a marvel of trade, science, and art. Amsterdam's ports bustled with global goods. Painters, like Rembrandt, flourished. But this glittering success rested on colonial brutality, enslaved labor in Indonesia, the violent trade of spices and sugar, and the subjugation of foreign peoples. The wealth of the Dutch Republic came with blood on every coin. The same can be said for Spain in the aftermath of the conquest of the Americas. Ships returned with unimaginable quantities of gold and silver, looted from the Aztec and Inca empires. The Spanish crown grew richer than any in Europe. Yet the influx of gold caused runaway inflation, economic collapse, and deepened inequality. The poor in Spain did not benefit from the empire's riches. They suffered while the state decayed from the inside out. Misery wore a crown. In Imperial Britain, the Industrial Revolution created vast fortunes. London became the heart of a global empire. But that empire was sustained through the exploitation of Irish farmers, Indian weavers, African laborers, and Caribbean slaves. Wealth flowed into the capital while famine struck the colonies. Even within Britain, the industrial cities were lined with soot and death. Children worked in coal mines, women in textile factories. Misery was not an accident. It was the fuel of gold. During the Belle Époque in France, the so-called Beautiful Era, Paris glowed with innovation and opulence. Cafes brimmed with artists. The Eiffel Tower pierced the sky. Yet this surface elegance hid brutal inequalities. The working class lived in overcrowded slums. Many women resorted to prostitution to survive. Strikes and protests were frequent. The golden image was carefully curated, but for most, it was an illusion. Austria-Hungary, in its final years, looked refined on the outside. Its elite spoke multiple languages, enjoyed lavish balls, composed symphonies. But the empire's foundation was cracking. Ethnic groups were silenced. Rural regions remained impoverished. Peasants starved while the capital danced. The gold couldn't hold the fractures together. When World War I came, the empire shattered, and with it, the illusion of progress. Even in Nazi Germany, misery wore a mask of prosperity. The regime boasted low unemployment, infrastructure projects, and national pride. But this prosperity was built on rearmament, slave labor, stolen property, and the brutal suppression of dissent. Jews, Roma, political opponents, all stripped of wealth and freedom so the Reich could shine. The economy grew on a foundation of theft and suffering. Golden numbers, blackened souls. In the modern era, European financial hubs like London, Frankfurt, and Zurich continue to shine, but offshore tax havens, real estate speculation, and wealth hoarding have widened inequality. Homelessness rises beneath billion-dollar skylines. Mental health crises grow in the shadows of corporate towers. For many, the wealth of the few feels like a mocking mirror. Golden misery thrives because it's easy to believe that wealth equals progress, that shining cities mean a healthy nation, that if the art is beautiful, the society must be strong. But history teaches us the opposite. Sometimes, the more gold you see, the more suffering you've been taught to ignore. Ask yourself, whose suffering paid for your comfort? What misery was traded for your convenience? Because in Europe's darkest contradictions, the brightest treasures were often mined from the deepest wounds, and the most dangerous wealth is the kind that hides what it cost. Justice is meant to bring closure. A trial begins, arguments are made, verdicts are given, and society moves forward, wiser, perhaps even healed. But in the long shadows of European history, some crimes never ended in resolution. Some wounds were dragged into every new century, relitigated again and again in silence, in art, in politics. The gavel never fell. The courtroom was the continent itself. This is the paradox of eternal trial. When justice becomes a performance without end, when guilt is never fully assigned, reparations are never fully paid, and victims are remembered only when convenient, the trial never ends because no one truly wants it to. Take the Holocaust. After World War II, the Nuremberg trials made history, but they were selective. Many high-ranking Nazis were tried and punished, but others quietly reintegrated into society. Scientists were recruited by Allied powers. Businessmen reclaimed wealth. Judges who had upheld Nazi laws were later reappointed. Germany formally accepted guilt, but much of the machinery that enabled genocide simply changed uniforms. For decades, survivors watched their persecutors live peacefully. The trial, in their eyes, never ended. In post-Franco Spain, the regime's crimes, torture, executions, mass graves were never formally prosecuted. The 1977 amnesty law ensured immunity for perpetrators. Spain transitioned to democracy, but refused to dig up its own past. Even today, thousands of victims remain buried in unmarked graves. The families still wait. Commissions are proposed, then stalled. Every attempt at justice becomes a new argument, a trial with no jury, a sentence that never arrives. The Armenian genocide, carried out by the Ottoman Empire during World War I, resulted in the deaths of over 1 million Armenians. Yet to this day, many nations, especially Turkey, refuse to recognize it as genocide. This refusal perpetuates the wound. Armenians worldwide live with the weight of an acknowledged crime. Museums are built, poems written, but no courtroom has ever delivered a final judgment that the world accepts. The crime is past, but the trial persists. Even the colonial crimes of Europe remain largely untried. Britain, France, Belgium, and others ruled vast territories through violence, theft, and exploitation. Whole nations were reshaped, cultures crushed. Yet the legal framework for addressing these historical wrongs remains vague, symbolic at best. Apologies are made, but rarely reparations. Museums display stolen artifacts behind glass, accompanied by plaques and justifications. The legal question, who owns history, who owes justice, remains eternally open. The Balkan Wars of the 1990s also illustrate this paradox. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established to try war crimes, and some were punished. But ethnic divisions remain sharp. In some regions, war criminals are still considered heroes. Statues are raised in their honor. Victims are commemorated separately by ethnicity, not humanity. The tribunal ends, the trial does not. And consider the Catholic Church, Europe's most enduring institution. The sexual abuse scandals uncovered in Ireland, Poland, France, and Italy shocked the world. The reports were published. Priests defrocked. but many survivors still await recognition and compensation. The church apologizes, investigates itself, and moves on. Meanwhile, those harmed live in the same neighborhoods as their abusers. Some were silenced through confidentiality agreements. For them, justice remains a prayer unanswered. What makes the eternal trial so tragic is that it offers just enough performance to feel real. There are inquiries, commissions, and hearings, but they often end without resolution. They fade into bureaucracy, political deflection, or simple exhaustion. Truth is debated endlessly. Justice becomes an illusion of process. Ask yourself, how many crimes in history have you heard of, but never saw resolved? How many wounds are treated with silence instead of accountability? Because in Europe's darkest hours, justice wasn't always blind. Sometimes it's simply turned away. And when a trial never ends, the guilty remain among the free. The innocent remain unheard. And the future remains chained to the crimes of the past. Silence is often seen as peace, a break in conflict, a moment of reflection. But silence can also be fire beneath the floorboards, pressure behind sealed lips. It can be the echo of screams that no one dares repeat. In the darkest corners of European history, silence hasn't been healing. It has been corrosive. It has been chosen. It has been enforced. This is the paradox of burning silence, when the refusal to speak becomes its own kind of violence, when nations, families, and survivors suppress the truth not because it is gone, but because it is unbearable. One of the clearest examples lies in post-war Germany. After the fall of the Third Reich, millions of ordinary Germans who had participated, directly or indirectly, in Nazi crimes simply stopped talking. In households across the country, children grew up hearing nothing about what their fathers had done during the war. The word Auschwitz was absent at the dinner table. The Holocaust became a national trauma wrapped in domestic silence. It wasn't until the 1960s, when a new generation began to ask, that the silence cracked open, and even then, many resisted. The fire was still burning under layers of quiet. In France, the silence around the country's collaboration with Nazi occupiers was profound. For decades, the myth of national resistance was promoted, de Gaulle's proud, unified France. But the truth was more complex. The Vichy government had aided the Nazis, deported Jews, and suppressed dissent. After the war, few collaborators were punished. The rest simply melted back into civilian life. Talk of Vichy was taboo. Teachers avoided the subject. Survivors of deportation found no audience. The silence burned behind monuments to freedom. Ireland offers another example, this time shaped by religion. For generations, abuse carried out by priests and nuns in orphanages and schools was ignored, denied, or explained away. Victims who tried to speak out were shamed. Families urged them to keep quiet for the sake of the church's good name. Entire communities conspired in silence, not because they didn't believe the children, but because they didn't want to face the truth. When the revelations finally broke in the 1990s and 2000s, they exploded like fire long buried underground. And in Eastern Europe, under Soviet rule, silence was mandatory. In Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and beyond, state surveillance, censorship, and fear meant that entire generations learned to say nothing, to endure oppression with blank faces. After the collapse of communism, these nations struggled not just with political rebuilding, but with psychological unfreezing. Families were divided by secrets. Records revealed that trusted friends had been informants, and even then, many chose to keep quiet. The silence was familiar. Speaking still felt dangerous. During the Spanish Civil War and the dictatorship that followed, silence was institutional. Thousands of people disappeared. Graves were left unmarked. After Franco's death, the country adopted a so-called Pact of Forgetting, an agreement not to prosecute or dig too deeply into the past. It was presented as a way to keep the peace. But for victims' families, it was another wound. Silence as national policy. Mourning as a private, unspoken act. What makes burning silence so devastating is that it masquerades as stability. Leaders say, "Let's move on." Communities say, "Let's not reopen old wounds." But wounds don't heal in darkness, they fester. The silence doesn't prevent another fire, it feeds it, making sure the next one will burn hotter, deeper, wider. This silence isn't always forced. Sometimes it's voluntary. Survivors of war, genocide, and abuse often choose not to speak. Not because they forget, but because the memory is unbearable. Because they fear being doubted or being shattered by the retelling. And yet, that very silence becomes a legacy, a second trauma passed on to children and grandchildren who grow up sensing a pain they can't name. Ask yourself, what stories are missing from your family's history? What tragedies were swallowed whole, never to be spoken again? Because in Europe's long night of wars and regimes, silence was often the preferred tool of power. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. The silence of complicity. The silence that burns. In the eyes of faith, greed is a sin. Spiritual purity is meant to transcend earthly possessions. Yet, for centuries, some of the most powerful institutions in Europe, built in the name of God, amassed wealth beyond imagination. They preached humility while hoarding gold. They fed the poor with sermons while feeding themselves with estates, tributes, and indulgences. This is the paradox of pious greed. When sacred vows are used to justify profane appetites, and when those who claim to guide the soul become enslaved by the very riches they condemn. Look no further than the Catholic Church during the height of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Popes sat on golden thrones, wore crowns more extravagant than any king, and presided over palaces filled with silk, art, and silver. The Vatican became not just a religious center, but a political empire. It collected taxes from the faithful across Europe. It sold indulgences, certificates promising forgiveness in exchange for money. The gates of heaven were, quite literally, for sale. This system provoked fury in reformers like Martin Luther, whose 95 Theses in 1517 directly condemned the church's greed. He saw the clergy living in luxury while peasants starved. Bishops wielded power like princes. Monasteries became fortresses of privilege. The Protestant Reformation was not just a theological revolt, it was a rebellion against the spiritual, corruption of material excess. But the Catholic Church was not alone. In Eastern Orthodoxy, the Russian Church acquired massive landholdings and wealth, often aligning with Tsarist power. Monasteries became centers of economic control. Priests were immune to taxes, yet extracted them from others. When revolutions came, it was often the hypocrisy of the church, not just the oppression of the state, that drove mobs to fury. In France, prior to the revolution, the First Estate, comprised of clergy, owned 10% of all land. While the common people struggled with famine and taxation, the church lived in comfort. Priests blessed the monarchy, sanctified inequality, and denounced rebellion. But when the revolution ignited, the people remembered. Churches were ransacked. Priests were stripped of their power. The guillotine did not discriminate between noble and pious. In colonial missions, European powers sent priests alongside soldiers, not just to spread Christianity, but to manage local populations. These missions often seized native lands, converted souls at the end of a sword, and introduced economic systems that favored the empire. The church was used to justify conquest, claiming it brought civilization. But the civilization it brought enriched the few and impoverished the many. One of the most haunting examples of pious greed lies in Nazi Germany, where some segments of the church, particularly the hierarchy of certain Protestant and Catholic institutions, remained silent or complicit in exchange for preservation of power and property. While some clergy resisted bravely, others adapted, looking away from genocide and repression as long as their status was left untouched. Even in modern times, wealth and religious institutions remain entangled. The Vatican's finances are shrouded in secrecy. Scandals have erupted over embezzlement, lavish lifestyles, and real estate empires. Megachurches and televangelists, though more prominent in America, have their European mirrors. Pious words remain, but golden altars still shine. What makes pious greed so insidious is its ability to mask itself as righteousness. When greed wears the robes of the sacred, it becomes harder to question. Who dares accuse a man of God? Who doubts the benevolence of an institution that buries the poor for free but builds cathedrals with stolen coins? Ask yourself, how many fortunes have been built in the name of salvation? How many prayers were whispered while the offering plate was passed again? Because in Europe's darkest dualities, gold and God often walked hand in hand, not as opposites, but as partners. And when greed becomes divine, there is no higher authority to stop it. Trust is supposed to be a refuge, a feeling of safety, a bond formed through love, loyalty, or shared belief. But history tells us something much more unsettling, that in times of darkness, the people most trusted, family, priests, neighbors, even children, can become the very agents of terror, and worse still, that some of the most brutal regimes survived because they were trusted. This is the paradox of trusted fear. When fear is not imposed by strangers, but delivered by those closest to you. When terror wears the face of trust. In the East Germany, under the rule of the Stasi, the most effective surveillance wasn't carried out by men in trench coats. It was done by friends and family. The Stasi turned millions into informants, many of whom agreed not through coercion, but through a warped sense of duty. Parents informed on children, wives informed on husbands. Trust became a trap. You never knew who was listening, but everyone was watching. Fear was injected not from above, but from within. In Stalinist Russia, the same pattern emerged. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, encouraged citizens to report anti-Soviet behavior. A misplaced joke, a foreign radio signal, an unguarded complaint about bread. All could lead to arrest. And so, people turned on each other, not always out of fear, but sometimes out of sincere belief that they were protecting the revolution. Stalin was trusted. The state was holy. The gulags were filled by loyal citizens doing what they thought was right. One of the most haunting examples of trusted fear lies in Nazi Germany's Hitler Youth. Children were indoctrinated from an early age to serve the Reich. They were taught loyalty to Hitler above family, and some took it to heart, reporting their own parents for anti-Nazi speech. In one case, 17-year-old Walter K. informed on his father, who was arrested and executed. Walter was later praised as a model citizen. The state had successfully replaced the family. Love was sacrificed on the altar of ideology. In Spain, under Franco's dictatorship, neighbors became tools of the regime. The civil guard often relied on locals to point out suspected Republicans or dissenters. Entire villages became echo chambers of paranoia. To speak freely was to risk exposure, not to a foreign invader, but to your neighbor at the bakery, your cousin at the church. This pattern echoes across Europe's colonized regions as well. In Algeria, during the French occupation, local collaborators, often driven by complex motivations, helped suppress independence movements. In India, British rule was sustained in part through local elites who enforced imperial policies. These collaborators weren't always traitors. They were often trusted leaders, but trust had been weaponized. What makes trusted fear so devastating is its intimacy. It doesn't feel like tyranny. It feels like community. It doesn't arrive with a siren. It arrives with a smile. It works because it knows you, because it is you. Even in post-authoritarian Europe, the legacy of trusted fear lingers. In Poland, debates still rage over who collaborated with the communist regime. In Romania, the Securitate's files revealed shocking betrayals within churches, universities, and families. In many cases, the informants believed they were doing good. They trusted the system, even as it devoured their neighbors. And today, as surveillance becomes digital, the threat of trusted fear evolves. Your phone, your apps, your own voice assistants may not serve you. They may serve the state or corporation behind them. You trust them because they're helpful. But behind the convenience may lie the same old fear, repackaged for the modern age. Ask yourself, who do you trust the most, and what would happen if they were the very ones watching you? Because in Europe's history, fear didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it sat at your kitchen table. Sometimes it tucked you in at night, and you never saw it coming because you loved it. Across these 30 paradoxes, a chilling portrait of Europe emerges. Not of a continent always moving forward, but of one caught in an eternal loop. Progress shadowed by betrayal. Glory followed by genocide. Wealth built on chains. Faith warped by greed. Peace haunted by unspoken screams. Each era promised something new, yet echoed the darkness of the last. And often, the most disturbing truths weren't found in blood-soaked battlefields, but in silence, in law, in trust, where ordinary people became instruments of cruelty, sometimes without even realizing it. These weren't accidents. These were patterns, repeated, justified, forgotten, and then repeated again. Europe is not unique in its horrors, but its contradictions are particularly sharp. It is the birthplace of democracy and fascism, of enlightenment and inquisition, of art that moves the soul and systems that break it. So what do we do with all this? We remember. Not with nostalgia, not with guilt, but with vigilance. Because history doesn't just live in books or museums. It lives in systems, in silence, in trust, in law. And if we're not careful, the same paradoxes will rise again. Dressed in modern clothes, using modern tools. So as you drift into sleep or linger in thought, hold on to one final question. What's more dangerous? What we remember from history, or what we're still trying to forget?